Good evening, everyone. My name's Todd Wilkinson, coming to you from Big Sky, Montana, and the Big Sky Big Ideas Festival. Tonight, we're going to have a very provocative discussion about climate change, how it's affecting the natural world, how it's affecting human lives. And I will say from the start that we are soundly within the grounds of the radical middle. We are neither denialists nor are we doomsdayists. And tonight, you're going to hear from a star-studded panel. Before I go further, I just want to give a shout out to Enyon Williams, who is the choreographer tonight, and his team that you can't see, but they too are all-stars there. I want to begin tonight. I'll offer a short introduction about myself and then introduce the panelists, and we'll get into seeing a very sweet film. Again, my name's Todd Wilkinson. I've been a journalist for 35 years, primarily cover the greater Yellowstone region, but I've had assignments that have taken me around the world. I am a correspondent for National Geographic and The Guardian and founder of a site called Mountain Journal, and you can find that at mountainjournal.org. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists. I'd like to begin with Dr. Cathy Whitlock. She's a Regents Professor Emerita in Earth Sciences at Montana State University and a Fellow of the Montana Institute on Ecosystems. Cathy is nationally and internationally recognized for her research and leadership activities in the field of climate and environmental change. Her studies of Yellowstone's environmental history began in the 1980s when she started to collect sediment cores from lakes in search of information about past vegetation and climate change. This research continues to this day in Yellowstone and in comparable places around the world. In the course of her career, Cathy has trained dozens of undergraduate and graduate students to join her in this field of paleoecology. She served as lead author of the 2017 Montana Climate Assessment, which has inspired climate change discussions across the state and led to the recent Montana Climate Solutions Plan, a consensus document for Montana's future. She is currently working with a team on developing a climate assessment for the greater Yellowstone area that will be released later this year. Cathy has received numerous awards and honors, and notably, she is the first Montanan to become accepted into the National Academy of Sciences. So welcome, Cathy. It's great to have you here. Next, I'd like to introduce Kristen Gardner, who is a Mainer, transplanted in the West. Since 2007, Kristen has served as executive director of the Gallatin River Task Force. The task force is a small nonprofit watershed group headquartered in Big Sky that leads high-impact conservation projects to protect the Gallatin River, guided by science. Prior to her role at the task force, Kristen conducted water quality research on the Gallatin as part of her doctoral degree from Montana State University in ecology and environmental sciences. Again, originally from Maine, she moved west with a background in water resources engineering and environmental policy from Tufts University and experience working with the Nantucket community on groundwater quality issues. Kristen and her husband JJ, son Elijah, and yellow lab Althea reside in Big Sky and spend as much time as possible exploring the outdoors in and beyond Montana. Welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce a glaciologist. Dr. Twila Moon is a research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, part of the University of Colorado Boulder's Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, a world leader in earth science. Dr. Moon is an expert in glaciers and ice sheets and the connections among ice, climate, ocean, and ecosystem. Her primary focus is on the Greenland ice sheet and the Arctic. Her research has been published in high-impact journals like Science and Nature, and she's been covered by media around the world. An accomplished science communicator, Dr. Moon is leading efforts to improve knowledge exchange between scientists and shareholders. After receiving degrees at Stanford and the University of Washington, she conducted research at the University of Colorado, University of Oregon, and University of Bristol in the UK before returning to the National Snow and Ice Data Center in 2017. After living and working from Big Sky, Montana between 2008 and 2020, Twila now works from her home in Billings while she and her husband build a low-energy house in Red Lodge. Additional information on her work can be found at www.changingice.com. Last, but certainly not least, we have filmmaker Max Lowe. Known for his ability to capture stories in the most remote corners of the world, Max has honed his skill as a director and photographer in his search for adventure and narratives unheard. From his home in the mountains of Montana to now countless countries, landscapes, and cultures across the globe, Max has been witness to stories spanning the gap of human experience. Beginning his career with National Geographic in 2012, with the Young Explorers Grant, and then going on to work with National Geographic magazine itself, as well as National Geographic Adventure and Travel, he forged a career for himself traversing the globe, telling both his own stories as well as those of the people he encountered along the way. In recent years, Max has directed, shot, and produced numerous award-winning short documentary films, and most recently directed a feature documentary film, Torn, T-O-R-N, with National Geographic Channel. With the background in journalistic-style storytelling honed over years of work with National Geographic and other media brands, Max has emerged with a distinct style by which he crafts narratives unheard. And tonight, we're privileged to be able to see one of Max's pieces. And Max, could you tell us a little bit about the film before we go into it, please?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Todd. This film that we'll see this evening is one that I directed several years ago now in partnership with a local nonprofit here in Bozeman, Polar Bears International. They work all around the globe with scientists in the Arctic regions, wherever polar bears show up, and operate mainly where we shot the film in northern Manitoba. And I won't say too much more. You'll learn a lot in the film, and we'll discuss a little bit more about it after we screen it. So without further ado, the film.
When you first just look out, it looks like you're on the moon. The sea ice is just these huge white expanses that are cracking and moving. It's never the same. It blows my mind that a bear adapted to live on this landscape and thrive in this landscape.
You know, I don't like to be cold, but I've learned how to dress for it and stay pretty comfortable. You got to keep looking up and down the beach because it's highly likely a bear could walk up on us. This area has always had just annual ice, which means that the ice has melted entirely every summer. Even if the bay wasn't frozen by this time, we often would see more ice than this. We look out into the bay and there's no ice to see anywhere. And that means that the polar bears have to fast for a longer period because there's really nothing for them to eat on land. I would say, you know, yearling is the most likely, but it's definitely a good sized one.
More questions coming in. These are really great questions. So Steve, why can't we just go around spreading out some sort of feeding stations for these bears while they're waiting for food?
Years ago, I did a little calculation of how much it would cost to feed these bears on the shore of western Hudson Bay, and it was over $1 million a month to get up here. This is I'm one of the few people that I know who ended up doing in life what I wanted to do since I was a little kid. I just always wanted to do wildlife research, and I was always especially enamored of bears. I've been working on polar bears nearly 40 years, and I've helped to get polar bears listed as a threatened species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act.
Dr. Armstrong, could you tell us, in your opinion, how endangered is the polar bear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our research completed this past summer suggested that within the next 50 years or so, that population of polar bears could decline by approximately 2/3 because of changes in the sea ice habitat that are related to global warming. In May of 2008, polar bears were listed as a threatened species, and that was the single biggest accomplishment in my career.
More than 15,000 scientists are sounding an alarm.
The pace of sea ice decline and surface ocean warming is unprecedented.
95% of the oldest Arctic ice has melted.
Experts are telling us that the ice is reaching one of its lowest minimums in decades.
Polar bears are worse off than
habitats are melting under their feet.
Are disappearing. This is shocking images.
It's a whole ecosystem that is threatened.
Unfortunately, the rest of the story is here we are 10 years later, and we really haven't done anything to save polar bears. We're running out of time.
I was standing on the sea ice, watching these big white bears with their tiny little cubs navigate this barren-looking, freezing cold environment. And the respect it gives you for this animal is just, I don't know if I have words for it. It was just this like deep admiration. This place, it's so wild. I mean, wherever you want to go, you're surrounded by nature, and the people here know that, and they live with nature.
Churchill is the farthest north that you can get in Manitoba, on the coast of the Hudson Bay, polar bear capital, blue capital, and Northern Lights capital of the world, which is very cool. We got 3 capitals. I moved in with my grandma when I was 10. My grandparents have been here for a very long time. You have your family here, and you have your past here, and you have like your heritage, right, you know? I work 3 jobs, and then I work 2 jobs around the school year. People don't see how hard it actually is to live here. I think that Churchill kind of depends on polar bears, because if we didn't have tourists, we wouldn't really have much of a town. Climate change is real, but like so many people are so skeptical about it, and everyone's very old school here, so I don't think they believe anything new. I was never really scared of polar bears because it seemed like such a common thing that people had to deal with here. Me and my friend were walking up the street right after volleyball. And at the end of the street, a mother and a cub ran by, and then we turned around, we just started running, which is not the thing you're supposed to do. You're supposed to like drop stuff and like be careful and like walk back slowly.
As the sea ice is declining, the bears are spending more time on land where they don't have anything to eat. So bears come into villages, bears come into communities, and there can be an attack or a scary event. One of the things that we really can do to help polar bears is try and minimize those interactions, developing early detection systems, developing ways of chasing the bears away before they get into a situation where either a human is injured or a bear has to be shot.
This is compact surveillance radar, a system that we're testing as an early warning detection system for polar bears. In the last couple of hours, we have something like 10 or so different targets that this system has picked up. And so our hopes is that a system like this could be used in the communities in the north to help detect polar bears before they get into trouble.
When you have polar bears on land longer, they're going to be hungrier, they're going to be sniffing out food and garbage. And so towns are going to see more polar bear incidents. Were you in town when that happened?
Yeah, I was just walking home from the gym with my friend.
Jesus, I'm glad you're with a friend. That's freaky. This helicopter's acting in a way that makes me think that there is a bear around, so we'll keep our eyes out. Is that polar bear alert right there?
Yes, it is.
I pulled over because I saw the helicopter do spins and then polar bear alert, so I was like, if they're hazing a bear, I want to stay out of the way. Bear shots, back in the vehicle. People are going to need to reduce the number of human and polar bear incidents. The best thing that we can do is try to keep supporting, keep developing new tools, but it's going to be a winding road.
Before I started working with Polar Bears International, I took a job in Alaska to take over the polar bear research program. It was dedicated research trying to understand everything we could about polar bears. Movements, distribution, denning, population dynamics. The scientific community had been talking about global warming and the climate changes that it was causing for quite a long time. All over the world, habitat was gradually declining. Suddenly, it was more and more difficult to get out on the ice in the fall. The bear population was not looking good. They make their living by feeding on seals that they catch from the surface of the sea ice. So the survival of cubs wasn't as good. The animals didn't seem to be as big, as vigorous. And And that's been the trend that we've been on ever since. This is a really difficult video to watch. It shows a starving mother polar bear with 2 cubs, and it shows one of those cubs going into convulsions right before it actually dies in front of the camera. When scientists say that survival rates of polar bears are declining, to make sure that we communicate the science that I've personally learned, the science that others have learned, and inspire people to change things that they buy, change the way they eat, and most importantly, change the way they vote. Yeah, now we can see today.
I want to make an impression. I want to excite young men and women. And maybe it's not directly polar bear related, but maybe they're inspired enough to go make these daily choices that are going to add up huge over their lifetime to just make the future cleaner and better.
We know how many classrooms are logging into this?
Looks like a few thousand are tuning in, at least, yeah, plus the interviewers.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the biggest threat to polar bears is the loss of their home, their habitat, the sea ice.
I run our education program. I get to talk to kids all over the world about polar bears, help them get motivated to do something for polar bears no matter where they live.
This job is probably the most interesting thing that happened here. Like at the Northern, I'd just be stocking shelves right now. Here, I've done so many incredible things. I don't know, it just broadens my horizons.
I've heard that there's a dead cub out here with a couple of male bears feeding on it. They were able to get too close to a female that had cubs and snatch one. All these bears are hungry, and bears have been known to eat each other, so the longer they wait, the more likely events like this are going to occur. Male bear over here was able to catch and kill one of the cubs. Got a couple of male bears over here that are kind of been fighting over the dead bear. The mother here looks like she's going to go try and investigate what's happening over there with her cubs, so we might see some interaction. It's kind of being daring. She dashed in and grabbed the remains of her cub and started dragging it down the beach. We can imagine that it's some kind of a maternal attachment to her offspring. Having spent most of my adult life studying polar bears, I am personally quite tied to an outcome here. I don't want to see polar bears disappear. We can think of these bears as messengers. It's a tragic message, but these kinds of events unfolding in the Arctic tell us what kinds of events are to come to all of us. We could expect really major changes in the ecosystem here that are way beyond just the loss of polar bears. If we act within the next 10 to 12 years, we'll halt a lot of those other changes. We can save a world that's still pretty similar to the one that we've all known. If we let it go much beyond that, it's going to be a very different world.
I guess my biggest fear would be that as a scientist, I didn't do enough. If we get our planet back on track, we can keep sea ice around and we will keep polar bears. That is a motivator.
I think the saving the bears equals saving the people, because you're saving communities.
Mostly I feel motivated, and that's thanks to the kids that are so on board, the adults that are making changes, the leaders that are starting to step up, and the people like Steve that are just these really powerful voices for positive change in the direction that all of humanity should be going in.
What I'm hoping now is that we'll soon move the world beyond a point of hope to the courage that people are going to need to actually go out and do it. People are not just observers of ecology, we're participants in it. Every time you step out the door of your house, you have some influence and you have some ability to influence the world.
Wow. Just incredibly wrenching stuff. It's hard to mount a response to something like that that just seems so big and overwhelming. And as I mentioned at the start of this, we're neither in the realm of climate change denialists, we've moved past that, but neither are we into this end of the world stuff. But that doesn't mean that this radical middle space that we're in isn't deadly serious. So Max, when you were making the film, you know, what were the things that struck you most about this? What are the things that stick out when you look back on this piece? And in addition to that, I want to know, you know, what is it? Tell us a little bit about yourself, about what motivates you.
Sure. I mean, going into this project, I was much like anyone else who had heard about polar bears and, you know, the fact that climate change was, you know, going to wipe them out. And like anything that's far removed from us, it's hard to really put yourself in that emotionally or in any sort of tangible way. So traveling to the Arctic, you know, was something that I wanted to do for myself for a long time, to see this place. And, you know, that just the fact that we traveled to places like this, and myself as a storyteller, speaking with Twila before and her travels to Greenland, you know, you have this kind of attached guilt that you're traveling to these places to tell these stories and do this important work, and you're doing it on an airplane and burning fossil fuels yourself. So, you know, just going up there to do this and see this thing, you know, it had a lot of personal emotion attached for me. Being up there and working on this film, you know, it's an alien world, not only because you're, you know, in this Arctic landscape where it's negative 20 degrees with wind chill pretty much every day, and there's only 6 hours of daylight, which presents all sorts of other complications when you're trying to film a movie. But you're also in this environment where there's an apex predator that wants to and will, if given the chance, eat you if they catch you unprepared and out in the open. So, I mean, that was also part of the reality that we wanted to capture, was, you know, not only the perspective of people like Steve and Alyssa who work with PBI and have this much more global and broad perspective, but also people who are just living there in this environment and experiencing this thing that's happening in their backyard. Polar bears, you know, way back when, spent their entire lives on the sea ice because the sea ice was there all year long. Even through the summertime, they would be out on the ice hunting seals. And now the sea ice is gone every spring and earlier and takes longer in the fall to form. So the bears are on land for this super long period and starving through that period, mostly because they're so used to eating seals, which are high in fat and nutrients. And so that conflict of them being pushed into these communities of people is a whole another element that we tried to bake into the story in some small way. But yeah, I mean, it was a remarkable experience and one that I definitely cherish personally, and it was an honor to tell the story.
Well, thanks for that. And, you know, all good storytelling isn't just communicating information, but it causes the viewer to think. And excellent work, excellent work. Thank you. Twila Moon, what is it? Tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it that motivates you to do the work you do? And tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I first met a big valley glacier when I was in college. I was on a travel abroad. We hiked up into the Himalaya, and one day we were taking our hike to the edge of a glacier. It was summer. You could hear water dripping. You could see rock falling. It just felt really alive to me. And boom, I was hooked. I was like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a glaciologist. And this was really at a time in just at the start of the 21st century, just at the start of the 2000s. We weren't still thinking about places like Greenland or Antarctica changing really rapidly. So part of my decision, people think about becoming a glaciologist today. They want to be involved in understanding climate impacts. I wasn't thinking about that. I was in love with ice. And part of that first group of people who were doing the observations to realize how quickly this can change. And one of the unique things about being an earth scientist is you get a real education in how connected every part of our earth system is, including people and the food and the animals and the water and the air that we depend on, and how sensitive that system is to small changes within it. And now, I mean, I still feel like I'm pretty young, and the change that we've seen has just been stunning. But so I do think, you know, we have to spend some time recognizing sadness, recognizing grief, recognizing the really unpleasant and difficult feelings that coming with seeing these changes happening in our world. But we then have to take ourselves back out of that. And the way that I do that, right now I'm listening to a podcast called How to Save a Planet. I'm in love with it. I'm reading a book called All We Can Save. That's a bunch of essays about all the things we can save. And taking action, realizing that all of these changes are not out of our hands. I think it can be especially easy to get lost in the climate blues if you don't feel like you have a place to make a difference. But I thought the point that we saw here at the end of the film, when he was saying every one of us, every time we get up in the morning, we are making decisions that are going to make a difference. And being able to take those actions, communicate with other people about it, share shared solutions, that is the stuff that really gives me hope and makes me really believe that we're not going to be, you know, coming back to a world that was 20 years ago, but we definitely can avoid kind of the worst of what could happen.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Dr. Cathy Whitlock, tell us a bit about what inspires you, what motivates you in the work that you're doing, and, you know, Cathy Whitlock, who are you?
Well, let me start by saying that climate science is a big tent. And there's a lot of scientists from different disciplines that work in it. There's people that look at indigenous ways of knowing about climate change. Twila looks at glaciers. There's computer scientists that are running models for what climate will be like in the future. And I study past climate change and how it affects ecosystems. So you can do that with ice cores, or you can do that with ocean records, but I'm really interested in what's happening in our mountain regions And so I go to lakes, collect sediment cores, and look at the fossils and the chemicals that are in those cores to try to reconstruct past climate. I came to Montana State University about 15 years ago from Oregon, and I was thrilled to come to Montana because I've done so much work in Yellowstone since the 80s, and I know the ecosystem really well, and I love the ecosystem, and to be able to be at Montana State University and bring students into the field to discover the changes that are going on was really a chance I couldn't pass up. And so one of the characters that I was most interested in your film, Max, was the high school girl, because she lived in this little town since she was a kid, but her horizon was so expanded by joining up with these scientists and going out and looking at polar bears with them. She didn't have to travel very far, but it was really an awakening to her. And that's what makes teaching so exciting when that kind of experience happens. Because I've done so much science in Yellowstone and places around the world, I'm now really in the game of writing climate assessments as well. And the goal of a climate assessment is to take the science from all these different climate areas and put it into knowledge that hopefully everybody can understand and is impactful. So that's kind of where I am now. We worked on the Montana climate assessment. We just released a report on human health and climate change in Montana. And now we're working full steam on a very detailed climate assessment for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Well, excellent. And I should note that the work of the Montana Climate Assessment has won kudos from the White House of saying that the Montana Climate Assessment is a model that could be emulated nationwide. So great work on that.
Thank you.
Kristen Gardner, a Mainer who comes west. You happen to be an advocate for one of our storied rivers, the Gallatin River, that flows out of Yellowstone, passes right by Big Sky, and helps form the confluence of the mighty Missouri. What is it that motivates you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So growing up in Maine, I really grew to love the outdoors, and I also love to ski. And so my dream job was to do something to protect the environment and in a ski town. And so here I am. You know, my background is in hydrology, not climate science, and starting off with the task force, that's really what we focused on for the first 8 years I was there. And in 2016, a bunch of different things happened that really changed the focus of our organization. One was that we were part of a national pilot project for the Upper Missouri water for drought planning. And about that same time, the results from the Montana Climate Assessment were released, and huge impacts on water supply. And that was fortuitous because we were just beginning a watershed planning process in the Big Sky community. And so that planning process originally was going to be only focused on wastewater management, and we ended up really focusing on water supply and ecological health as well. And so we have this great blueprint to address all of those issues in our community. And you know, I have an 11-year-old son. He loves to fly fish. We are out on the river all the time, and I just really want to see the river in the condition that I've been able to enjoy it in for my son and other future generations.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do now is move into some questions. And again, it's great to have all of you tuning in. We have an audience tonight from around the world. And Max, I'd like to move on to you. You are a Bozeman kid, this cosmopolitan city with great scientists around, and we have the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in our backyard, which is incomparable for its wildlife. You've grown up and you become a storyteller. You're a journalist. You also grew up in a clan that has a global perspective on mountain towns.
Every story that I tell is rooted in some sort of relationship that I can build with someone else, and thus broaden my own perspective on the world. You know, in a selfish sense, that's one of the reasons why I do what I do. And one of the greatest gifts that I was given by my family, as Todd mentioned, my late father, Alex Lowe, who was a mountaineer, and my stepdad, Conrad Anker, and my mom, Jennifer Lowe Anker, who grew up here in Montana and taught me how to fly fish. You know, they gave me this gift of perspective. And, you know, growing up in Montana was an amazing place to be growing up, surrounded by brilliant minds, scientists, writers, you know, people who were out in these wild places, seeing them firsthand. And to me, like, when you talk about something like climate change or something that is bigger than you in a way that you can't really relate, the way to relate to it is by stories from people who know it in an intimate sense. And so in recent years especially, I've really tried to hone in the stories that I try and tell in a more intimate way with people that, you know, I feel like have stories that I feel like need to be told in that way. Stories that otherwise you might remain silent because they're just too big to really comprehend. And I think it's through those relationships that you can see within films and the emotions that you're able to capture when you get someone talking about something that they're passionate about and have spent their entire life working on, that you're able to convey the feeling of these things that otherwise seem almost too intangible to touch.
Excellent. And I need to note that you and your two brothers, you are a low anchor tour de force, and your stepdad is now devoting his time to studying climate change, taking the lessons he's learned from the rafters of the world, and it just shows that it never stops. Advocacy never seems, there needs to stop. Cathy Whitlock. The Montana Climate Assessment and its follow-ups are really must-reads for people tuning in and who may not even know about them. And I would encourage everyone out there to Google Montana Climate Assessment to read the first piece that looked at water, agriculture, and forests and the impact on economies. The second part that just came out in January, officially released, Cathy collaborated with a number of public health officials to look at the impacts that really connect the fact that healthy environments have a link to healthy people and that what happens with climate change affects both. And then this summer, something I'm really excited about is to look at the ecological impacts on Yellowstone. So the most, you've mentioned in an interview that you worry about the future of wildlands. Could you please riff on that and maybe define for folks what the word resilience means within the context of climate change?
I'd be happy to. When I think of wildlands, I think about places that, of course, have little European influence on them. Most places have had long human influences through their history, but they haven't really suffered from the sort of alteration that Europeans have brought. Wildlands are not, is this all right?
Yeah, close.
Close.
Everybody close.
We're getting cues about, okay, wildlands are not always natural lands. And so that's what makes Yellowstone so extraordinary, because it's a place that's functioned for thousands of years with relatively little interference or alteration from people. Sure, people have been here, but they haven't really changed the ecosystem dynamics. So for me, wild places, of course, they're places with a lot of natural biodiversity, but they're also places where we can study natural processes operating, things like wildfires without interference, or droughts or floods without human interference. And that's what makes them so extraordinarily valuable. Some people think we should treat wild places like museums, that the climate's changing, and these are going to be the last remaining places on the planet that we can go visit while the rest of the planet deteriorates. I'm not sure that's a good scenario or a realistic scenario. Other people feel that these wild places are scientific laboratories and we should study and monitor them while they change. I think there's a little bit of both. Wild places need to be protected, and they also need to be studied.
Are we doing enough to study them?
No, I think we can do a lot more to study them. We need to do a lot more sort of monitoring of the ecosystem to understand how they're changing, how is the wildlife changing, how is even the snowpack changing through time, how is that impacting the runoff into our streams. These wild places are generally not well monitored or not as well monitored as they could be.
Excellent point, and I want to use that as a segue to go to Kristen for a minute. There's a chance for everyone to contribute, and I think your organization is an expression of people getting involved. So water is everything to Big Sky, which in a way is a river town when you think about it, parked along the Gallatin, but many don't think of it that way. Water is the foundation of its economic and ecological lifeblood. When you're working in this fast developing community, how are you trying to help make the issues of climate change palpable and tangible to people?
Great question. And our organization did just prioritize hiring a full-time communications manager because that is such, I think you need to reach out to those people and you need someone who has that expertise. So really making climate change accessible to folks, like if they're a fly fisherman, what happens to the trout if, the late season stream flows and warm temperatures, or if they're skiers, obviously we're going to have a shorter skier season, or boaters have a shorter boater season. So I think, relating it to their interests is the way to do it. And we've had some success with that. And I think also the storytelling is huge, like Max mentioned earlier. If you can personalize stories, I think that goes a really long way.
Excellent, thank you. Twila Moon. After these past 4 years in which campaigns have been waged to discredit scientists and science, question evidence and facts as best we know them, how fast, tell us what reality is on the ground. How fast are glaciers and snow cover disappearing or shrinking around the world?
Well, first I want to just tell you the good news that despite these misinformation campaigns or people trying to make up alternative realities that don't speak to the truth of what is happening with climate change, the vast majority of people value science. They understand that our job is to look at reality, check out observations, and try to really convey the truth of what's happening on the ground. So the good news is people understand the value of science still. But when it comes to telling you what that science is saying about ice, it is grim news. We can see we've been now losing for at least several decades much of our smaller ice around the world. So that would be, for example, the glaciers we have here in Glacier National Park in Montana. And unfortunately, we can't expect to lose those. That's also true of many of the other smaller glaciers around the world, in the Cascades, in the Olympics, in the Himalaya, in the Andes. And those glaciers are playing important roles for drinking water, agricultural water, hydropower, for really billions of people. Some of our largest ice on Earth, Greenland, has just started to lose more ice over the last 20 years. So now the last 24 years, every year we have been losing ice from the Greenland ice sheet, and Antarctica has begun to lose ice in these last 10 years. But I want to make a really important point here, which is that some of this ice, these smaller glaciers, even if we kind of go full ahead on strong action, climate action, we are going to lose some of these landscapes. And that's that part where I was talking about earlier. We are going to have to grieve some of these losses. And I have 7 nephews and nieces. I know I'm not going to be able to show them the very same landscapes I've seen. But if we take strong action, certainly the kind of inspiring action that I think the vast majority of Americans are on board for, people are all about renewables. People believe that we should be asking for climate action from the local to the national and international level. And if we do take those steps, we're going to be able to hold on to a lot of the landscapes we have. And I think that's such a key here, is that we have bits of ice we're going to lose. We're losing it now, but there's a lot that we can hold on to. But we really have to take the steps to do that.
Quick question. I read about the Europeans actually putting covers on some of their glaciers. Is that effective?
So I would say that's one of those sort of temporary Band-Aids. Glaciers have a lot of different roles that they play in communities. And so we can appreciate that glaciers can be important for tourists, they're important for water in different seasons. And so there are things that local groups do, like putting blankets over glaciers to help keep that ice in that point a little bit longer. But that's not the fix that's going to keep ice around for the long term. One of the kind of magical pieces about climate change is that all of these different impacts you're hearing about from us, they're all connected to the same fundamental source, emissions of polluting gases into the atmosphere. So really changing that fundamental behavior is what's going to influence wildfires, ice, animals, plants. So in some sense, you can take an action here and you can understand that it's actually going to radiate out and influence many different parts of our system, which is not common with a lot of problems, and I think makes climate change a bit unique, but also I think that much more possible for us to take action.
Great, thank you. Cathy Whitlock, this is kind of a two-parter. The first part follows something that Twila just said. You just mentioned a few minutes ago, off camera, 2 good pieces of good news. One was what the White House announced, and also the findings of a poll that you identified of where Americans stand. Could you tell us a bit about what you consider that to be good news in terms of engaging on climate?
With climate change, there's always good news and bad news sort of thing. And so you're either one day looking for the good news or getting just depressed about the bad news. But the Yale Climate Communication Center, their most recent poll said that 71% of Americans now think that climate change is happening. And that's up from several percentage points from even 5 years ago. So that's really good. And then the White House today just released an executive action plan for how to deal with climate change on federal lands, and also how to create green jobs, green energy jobs. So it's so wonderful because they're seeing climate changes as a physical Earth problem, of course, that we're causing, but also as a social justice issue. And so I think it's going to be really fun to watch what happens in the next few years. But at the same time I got that, I was just reading that new studies show that we're losing 1.2 trillion tons of ice globally now, which is up 60% from what they had originally estimated. And it's the sea level eating away underneath these glaciers and changing the dynamics in ways that climate change scientists hadn't considered.
Yeah, there is a recent study kind of bringing together information that looks at ice on land as well as ice in the ocean, sea ice, and we can see the amount of ice that we were losing in the 1990s. Now the amount of ice that we've lost over the last couple of decades is more than almost 60% more than that earlier period. honestly, the quantities of ice that we're losing on Earth right now are not numbers that I think are fathomable to us. We measure things in the gigaton. And many gigatons. So it is a bit unimaginable, and we are seeing those results with flooding at our shores and here with the polar bears as we saw. But there's still a very distinct difference as we imagine those different future scenarios, really, really distinct differences on how much ice we lose into the future depending on the actions we take.
Okay, thank you, thank you. One of the things we heard in your film was the young scientist who shared this lament, and she said she struggles with not knowing if she's doing enough, but trying to do as much as she can. And I want to bring this back to Cathy here. It's been fun to watch your stature grow within the American scientific community, and sort of, you began as this scientist not doing this flashy work, but you're out there kind of grinding it out at the start of your career and gaining insights over time. You and others are not activists, I don't think, and maybe you identify as an activist, but you are advocates for getting information out there and pushing through denial. How does this square with what you believed the role of a scientist was when you started your career?
Well, doing science is the most fun thing imaginable, especially field-based science. You can't imagine the thrill of going someplace where perhaps other scientists haven't been and seen something that no one's ever seen before, or having an idea that connects something that you've seen with something else in a way that nobody has. It's the biggest high there is. It's just a personal high. It's so much fun. And so that's what got me started, is I just love what I'm doing, and it's just so darn fun to go out and collect mud from lakes and look at what's in it and connect it to the other lake that you cored. So that's what's gotten me going. But you know, as I've gone on in my career, I've spent a lot of time talking to other scientists about my discoveries, and I've realized all along that there's a greater message to be had to the general public, not only about what I do, but what I'm finding out about things like climate change. And so I've sort of made this gradual shift towards realizing that not only should I do what I do because it's so fun and interesting, but I also have a bit of a responsibility to tell the public and try to help them understand why what I do is important and why the findings that climate scientists are bringing to the forefront should mean something to them.
Well, and we have three scientists up here. All of you are familiar with the precautionary principle, and it is act on the knowledge that we have now. And with climate change, we can't wait for the worst results to settle in before we respond to them. We have to anticipate. You know, I want to come back to the precautionary principle after we move through some questions, but I want you to think about what the precautionary principle means, because there are some who will try to demean scientists and say you're going beyond the data, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Kristen, give us, if you would, one example of where the Gallatin River Task Force is making great progress in protecting the river, and what are some of the challenges that need urgent attention?
I'm going to give you more than one. We've had a really great past year. The first is that we got a 1% tax added to resort tax to help or to fund produced a wild and scenic bill for the Gallatin. We've been working on that for almost 10 years now, and so that was really exciting. And then the third thing is that we formed a water and sewer district here in Gallatin Canyon. And so this whole area where we're in right now is on septic systems that do not treat water near to the level that a centralized system would. And so we're kind of moving in that direction. So we've had these huge wins, but they're also just steps. And there's a lot of work to move forward to see that full effect. One of the big issues that we're dealing with now and challenges is that we've had some recent algae blooms. The first one was in 2018, And when I watched Max's film, I thought of the messenger of the Gallatin as algae. Not as cute and snuggly as a polar bear, but you know, a messenger nonetheless. And I really, from the data, it looks like it's a combination of both warming temperatures and increased nutrient loading. So, you know, addressing that in the future will, I think, be a huge focus of our organization. We're in the middle of updating our strategic plan, but you know, that could have detrimental effects to the river if it continues.
Great, thank you. Max, we are the only ecosystem left in the lower 48 with its full complement of megafauna that was here in 1491. It's not because we're lucky, it's because conservation has worked here, and it's also because in some ways we're remote and we've charted a different course. So as a product of Greater Yellowstone, growing up here, what has going to far-flung places, including observing polar bears, taught you to better appreciate about this region and what young people growing up here might take for granted?
Yeah, I mean, having grown up here in Bozeman and Yellowstone being a mere hour away, this place that people travel to from all over the world to see, it was very easy to become disillusioned with the fact that we're super lucky to live in this place that affords us so much exposure to amazing wild places that, like you said, have in large part remained unchanged for hundreds of years. And traveling all over the world, you know, has only further emboldened my want to remain here in this environment that, you know, I grew up in, but really only began to put a ton of value on, you know, being from here, like in the last, you know, decade of my life. And that perspective was really the path that got me to that place. And just to follow up on some of the other stuff we've been talking about, you know, my storytelling, you know, it kind of started out, I'm sure as many storytellers do, in a more selfish side of things. I wanted to go and experience these things using the camera as a tool to do so. But as a storyteller, you know, I've seen in films made by others and stories told by others the tool that we can use within storytelling to take the science that, you know, for many of your average people just seems like this thing that is over there, something you hear about from time to time, and it's usually bad news. And you can take that block of information that is absolutely necessary if we're to further understand our environment, but also understand our place in it. And I think that that's something that I want to drive more into my storytelling, and that we need to drive more towards as a community, is driving home the story that, you know, we're part of this environment, and the impacts of climate change are not just impacting the glaciers and the science that is out here, it's in our own backyard. You know, we saw a massive forest fire in the Gallatin Valley this summer for the first time in a long time. And I'm sure that that was a wake-up call for a lot of people who, you know, see climate change as something that will impact their children, or, you know, something that they'll never really have to deal with. But yeah, it's the perspective you gain from, you know, stepping outside of your own backyard, but also stepping into the understanding that, you know, this is a problem for all of us in a very personal way, and we're going to have to face it here sooner than later.
Thank you for that. I think it's important to mention the context of Greater Yellowstone as this cradle of conservation, particularly wildlife conservation, advancing ecological understanding, is that even though we have this great complement of megafauna that's on the landscape, historically, we nearly lost everyone here. There was not an abundance that was passed on here, but the reason they're abundant today is because of conservation. You look at bison, grizzly bears, wolves, elk, bighorn sheep. There are people here who remember on the landscape when there weren't even many deer. So, Big Sky, Big Ideas Fest. And since you spent time in this community, and you are a skier as well, and you're a skier as well, please gaze into your crystal ball and speculate. What does the ski season look like in, say, 2080?
Well, you know, something that's remarkable about science is I don't have to look into a crystal ball. Scientists have been building off of knowledge for hundreds of years. We understand the physics of the system, the chemistry of the system. And so I went to scientific information about what it's going to be in 2080. I went to the Montana Climate Assessment. And in 2080, there's no question that our ski season's going to be shorter. It's going to be later in the fall that our rain starts to turn to snow. It's going to be earlier in spring that our snow starts to turn back to rain. And we're really going to be valuing those high elevation areas. The higher up you can get, the colder you can stay. But there's something kind of interesting about 2080. A lot of the changes that are going to happen over the next 1 or 2 decades of our climate system, our temperature change, that's been baked in by things we've already done. But by 2080, there's going to be a very clear difference in what our ski season looks like here, depending on whether we took strong action or took weak action. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, I was curious about, I'm sure I'm not the only person in Montana who's noticed this winter's been a little bit too warm for my liking. So I looked at the data, and over the last 3 to 6 months, we've been about 4 degrees warmer than average. Well, if we look into 2080, if we take really strong action, we would be looking at a normal winter that's in this 4 to 6 degrees warmer than average. So something not unlike this winter, or perhaps a bit warmer, is what we're going to see if we take strong action. If we don't take strong action, those temperatures look like 10 degrees warmer than what we're used to. That's not just this day, this month, that's all year round. We're starting to see Montana experience climates that we can see in parts of Texas. So I want people to understand our future is fundamentally different than it is now, but it is 100%.
Cathy Whitlock, I want to ask you a question. You prepared that first report that looks at economic impacts, which is really what seems to trigger a response from people if their pocketbooks are impacted or their traditions. What kind of a response, I don't mean to put you into a tight spot here, but what kinds of responses are you getting from policymakers who are people who you're handing off this information and this insight? How are they responding to this stuff?
Well, actually, the Montana Climate Assessment didn't look at economic impacts, but I'd love to do that. I'd love to see an assessment that looked at what it means for the economies and for the next assessment for the greater Yellowstone economies. The things that get people's attention are water. We've talked to people around the greater Yellowstone region about just private landowners, people that work in agencies, people in communities about what concerns them most. The other thing that people are worried about are themselves and their health. And that's why we ended up doing a second report on health, because the healthcare professionals came to us and said, you know, great, you talked about forests and you've talked about agriculture, but you didn't talk about our number one resource, and that's people. And so we worked with them on this healthcare report, and Montana is so vulnerable to climate change in terms of our health, because The most vulnerable groups of people are the old and the very young, and we have a very old population in Montana and also a burgeoning new population. People that live in poverty and far from services, they're very vulnerable. And then individuals that work outdoors because of the extreme heat and the smoke-filled days and the climate surprises that drive us all crazy. So,
what do you think those things are? What actually moves somebody to actually engage on this stuff? And I want to go down the list here.
I mean, I think that looking at our world in a storyteller's sense, like back in the day when, you know, people living in Big Sky didn't have internet and got most of their news from the newspaper, like you could be alarmed by something you hear, you know, that's happening, whether it's in Montana or at the world level at large. You know, with the amount of connectivity in this day and age, it's just so hard to rouse people, especially young folks, because, you know, you're just blasting through stuff. You can see a panda doing flips in a video over your breakfast cereal, you know, that would have amazed, you know, the world, you know, a mere 80 years ago. So I think that more and more, it has to be a very personal connection to something that impacts you. You know, and I think that we've seen that this past year, especially with COVID, like it seems like this very metaphysical, faraway thing until it touches you in a personal way. And I think that in my generation, like climate change more and more has to be that same way. You know, it has to be something that you can understand and feel in a very tangible, personal way for you to feel emotionally turned to advocate for, you know, the things that we're talking about, hopefully seeing changed.
And so, as a young person, or relatively young, what do you think people are willing to do to become activated? Is it marching? I mean, what do you think? What are people willing to do?
I mean, I think that people are probably not willing to change their own personal lives all that much, unfortunately. You know, we'll recycle, we'll ride our bikes when it's not too cold, you know, but we're still going to take vacations and fly on planes to go see our relatives and do fun stuff that burns gasoline because that's the system that's set up for us. I think that change will come when we're faced with enough of a personal reality that we see climate changing around us personally, and then we can rise up like we saw happen so many times throughout the last year and demand for change at an umbrella governmental level. And, you know, one of the things that I came away from the experience of making the film that we saw earlier was, like, Steve has been advocating for climate issues his entire life, his entire career. He's watched polar bears impacted by climate change. And, you know, he hasn't really seen all that much change, but he keeps coming back to the fact that if he can continue to work and impact individuals, children, young people at an emotional level by going out and spending his days sitting on a tundra buggy all fall and, you know, telling kids about polar bears, that maybe they'll care enough in their heart to grow up and, like, vote for people and demand that the people in charge.
As if that's kind of the crux, too, of people getting involved with the Gallatin, of realizing the various threats and that the options were running out. You can either be progressive on the upside of things, or it's going to be harder and more expensive to do things. What do you think? What motivates people? What do you think it is to take action on climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot with what Max said. It's those that personal connection with issues. So for, the algae bloom this summer, for example, was really shed light on the issues, as well as like having snow years like this year. You really need to like seize the opportunity when we have these sort of events, because it's in people's minds, and you can explain what that means and changes that they can make to make a difference. So I think it's really that personal connection and experience about something that you care about, whether it's fishing or skiing or boating or wildlife or whatever it might be.
Okay,
yeah.
Great, thank you. Cathy and Twila, I'd like you to address the same thing of what you think motivates people, but build into your answers, if you would, the precautionary principle of talking about the need not to wait until bad things happen. How does that factor into who you are as a scientist, and how important is that? So if you could attack those questions, each of you, I'd be grateful.
Well, I would say the science of climate change is pretty rock solid now, and 97% of climate scientists think that what we're seeing now is human caused. So I think that debate about, there's a disagreement in the scientists, that's just baloney, it's not true. I also think it's true that what we do, as Twila was saying, in the next 10 years, in terms of addressing climate change, is going to be the legacy that we leave for our children and our grandchildren. I mean, the time to act is now, and so we have to think about how to motivate people to act. I think one thing that we still do wrong about climate change is we make it be an issue when actually, I don't know, it's an existential issue? I kind of hate that way of saying it, but climate change impacts everything in our lives. It affects our economy, it affects what we do for our recreation, it affects what's happening to polar bears. It's not a either or, shall I work on climate change this year, or shall I work on healthcare? It affects everything, and we need to get that across. And then the last point I want to say is that it isn't going to probably be a lot of small actions that solve this problem. I once had an 8th grader ask me if she should take shorter showers to solve climate change, and I really was touched by that, because there probably is some benefit to doing that for not only the whole household, but maybe for the environment. But it's a policy issue, and there has to be some real bold leadership at high levels to force the fossil fuel industry, out of business, and to force us to move to renewable technologies and renewable energies.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, Todd, first I have to say, thinking about the precautionary principle, the unfortunate news is bad events have already happened. Species have gone extinct. We've seen mind-boggling wildfires we've never witnessed before, hurricanes, hurricane season, breaking records, flooding, difficulties with drought. We've seen extreme temperatures here where we've had to close down fishing in summers. Bad things have already happened. So we've passed that point, and I think people are starting to really see it in their personal lives. But there are 2 points here. I actually think it's not necessarily just that a person might feel a personal connection to an issue, or they might see the change. I actually think that the biggest thing you can do is have a personal ask to get involved. If someone that you love, your friend, your family member, your colleague at work, your worshiper at church, if that person makes a personal ask to you, hey, I've signed up to get renewable energy, will you do that too? That's where you see people take action, because it's not based on their valuing the climate or they're valuing polar bears, it's that they're valuing your relationship together. This person cares about this, I care about them, and I want to do this thing. And that takes us talking about climate change, and that's something we don't do enough. The vast majority of Americans are concerned about climate change, but very few hear about it in the media on a regular basis, and they discuss it even more rarely. And so we don't realize we're all in the same boat of concern together, and that in fact, people are figuring out really interesting solutions and ways to take action. And we're in a point where it's an and. We want this solution, and we need to take this action, and we need to take that action. And the cool thing is, if you get started doing it, it feels so good. It feels so good to take action. It feels so good to stand up, to make a little change in your life, to ask someone else and have a buddy that you're doing things with. And I think that's how we really see things start to roll, is making those personal asks. And that's not blasting something on social media. That's looking someone in the eye and saying, hey, do this with me.
This reminds me of a conversation I had with Ted Turner once, and he was, people were saying he was a hypocrite because he flew in an airplane in an age of climate change. And I interviewed Al Gore, same thing, and they were being crucified, and both of them said, you know, everybody is a hypocrite at some level, but if everybody did one more good thing than they did bad thing, we would collectively, that would be a massive collective action on climate change. So I want to pin everybody down here a little bit, because I think it's confusing about what that one action is. You know, if I recycle, am I going to, you know, ripple and climb? No, you're not going to do that. And I think we need to be honest on that. So the assertion is often made that we as a society aren't moving fast enough in addressing climate change. There are things like a carbon tax, a flat tax. If you impose that, seems like it would be swift in terms of cause and effect. What are your suggestions, each of you, for how we speed up society's response time? And please offer one single real thing. I mean, it seems to me that we have to inconvenience ourselves. It can't just be, well, we're going to take a minute off our shower. So what is that one single thing that we can do to help make something, collective action happen?
I'm happy to start with that, and I get to cheat some because I already told everyone you need to talk about it, and that means voting and telling our elected officials how important this is. But if I was going to kind of say, you know, one thing for you to do today, and you do it, that doesn't mean you check off the box and you forget about climate, right? This is your one thing that you're going to start. And for that, it's electrifying with renewables. And for those of us around here, call up Northwestern Energy, sign up for their E+ Green program, bam, your electricity is coming from renewable. If you're not here and you're not getting your energy from Northwest, sign on to arcadia.com, and they're going to help you offset your electricity using renewables. And one thing here in Montana is we have pretty well recognized that we're a resource-heavy state, right? We provide fossil fuels to people in Montana and also in states and countries around the world. But we're already seeing the impacts of a reduced market demand. We've been forced to close coal plants without really necessarily a plan for helping those people move forward. But I think if we open our eyes, the other thing is Montana is a leader in potential renewable energy. Our state is absolutely set up to provide renewables. And this is a place where we can lead and we can fill this demand that we know is going to be coming from our neighboring states and other countries, because collectively the nation has really opened their eyes and is moving towards this renewable future. And Montana has a real place where we can lead on that one. But we can all start by making our own electricity renewable.
Okay, great suggestion. Cathy Whitlock.
Well, I just signed up with Northwestern Energy after talking to Twila, so I guess she's the friend that reached out to the friend. So that's
same. I did too.
There you go. And you know, I think that's the most important thing that we need to do is flatten that temperature curve. And the only way we do that is reduce our carbon footprint. So I think we all need to keep track of what our carbon footprint actually is. And I fly too much, or before COVID, I flew quite a lot. I'm going to definitely not be doing that anymore. That's going to be something that I just do less of. And I think we all need to examine our carbon footprint and where we can make changes, whether we can go to renewables, eat less meat, all those things help. But the biggest thing we have to do as a country, as a state, as a region, as a planet is flatten that curve. But if I can say a word about wild places, the other thing we need to do is help species accommodate climate change, because we know from the paleo record that any time the climate's changed in the past, species either have to adapt or move or they go extinct. And we need to give species the space to move so that they can deal with the climate changes that are ahead. And so this idea of establishing connectivity in Greater Yellowstone and then connecting Greater Yellowstone, all the way up to places like the Yukon are so critical.
Okay. As a journalist who writes about this stuff, I want to push on you a little bit. So how does a citizen advocate for that?
I think that as we develop the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as it becomes more inhabited, we need to be thinking as watershed communities about what that means for connections for the wildlife that live there. That needs to be a conversation when any house is built in the woods, in addition to what are going to be the wildfire impacts. We need to be cognizant and not just always thinking about what's going to be, where's our dream house, where's it going to be located, but what's it going to mean for the wildlife? And I think that's a community and a watershed kind of discussion that needs to happen.
So to be clear, because we've talked about this before, what you're saying is we need to consciously make space for wildlife on the landscape, and if they move, we need to make sure we protect their seasonal corridors, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Okay. Krista.
All right.
Push yourself out of the comfort zone, and for listeners out there, nudge them a little bit too. What do we need to do?
Besides voting for local, state, and national leaders that will prioritize climate change, I think that's the biggest impact really that we can have. On a local level with water, change to native landscaping. In 2017, the Big Sky Water and Sewer District data showed that 85% of water used annually was to water landscapes. To me, that's a total waste of water. That water could be staying in the ground and feeding our streams when it's going to need it most, and mitigating those climate change impacts that we expect to see. So.
And wildlife eats native landscaping.
Yes.
You provide forage. So
perfect.
Just as we heard from your two other panelists, if someone wants to xeriscape, move to, what do they do? What's a step? Who do they contact?
They should contact the Gallatin River Task Force. We just produced a landscaping guide for native landscaping 2 years ago. So we have them in our office. They're on our website, gallatinrivertaskforce.org.
Okay.
And that's applicable to Montana. So if there are viewers from other places, you'd probably want to look and see who the appropriate entity would be. But
that's excellent.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Max.
I think that one of the things that I'm hoping to do as well is to hopefully fly less for my work. It's difficult as a storyteller and journalist when someone is like, okay, your next job is in this location and you have to go there to be there. It's difficult, but I think that one of the other things that Montana is rich in is stories. So one of the things I've been trying to wrap my head around a lot in the past year, having not been traveling very much, is how I can stay here in my own backyard and tell stories that are impactful in the same way. And then one of the things that I have been doing more in the recent, past 4 or 5 years is, at the end of the year, doing a little bit more research and identifying nonprofits that I can give money to. Having gone off and flown around the world and done these jobs, that I can give some of that resource back to the people who are doing work to impact the things that I feel are
there any
important.
groups or are there any areas in particular that you'd like to target?
Yeah, we were talking about mutual friend of ours, Guy Olsenser, and the Upper Missouri Waterkeepers Association. They're doing a lot of legal battles when it comes to water quality across the state. PBI, I have supported PBI now for the last however many years since I have friends that work there, and in my personal involvement through the film, supporting our local rivers. There's all sorts of like local nonprofits that need money to operate, and those people are out there, putting a lot of their own time on the line to help make these impacts that affect all of us in a positive way. So putting your money where your mouth is always, a good way to, I've found, to impact change.
Great. I want to ask each of you as we move toward wrapping up tonight I think it's important to end on an upbeat note, because climate change is so heavy, and sometimes climate change can be so heavy that it kind of saps the joy out of our life, worrying about the future. So when you think of like little examples that give you hope on this, what are a few of those things that give you hope when you think about what's happening with these enormous challenges? So let's start with Krista.
Little things that give me hope. I mentioned that watershed planning, that effort that we did, and our community is really engaged and working to achieve those priorities in the plan that will address climate change. For example, making snow with wastewater effluent, I think, has the potential to be a huge game changer, and there's an entity that's working on that right now. So I feel like there are a lot of people that care and want to do the right thing, and are working to do that in our community.
And so to be clear, for those out there who aren't familiar with this, instead of using water out of the water, artesian water or whatever, you use recycled water as for snowmaking, right?
Correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we also have worked on a project to install what's called purple pipe, and so that essentially is using treated wastewater to irrigate instead of using water from the aquifer. So there's a lot of really great efforts going around town right now that maybe don't make it out to the greater public, that is really exciting and hopeful.
So Big Sky is an engaged community and growing more so?
Yeah, more so than people think. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Max, how about yourself?
I mean, as much as climate change is this big dark cloud that hangs over the world these days, I mean, it's also, like, now more than ever before, there are more activists and scientists and people out there advocating for these changes that need to be made than ever before. I mean, Greta Thunberg was Times Person of the Year last year, a young person who dedicated their life to talking about this stuff. And, when we look at climate change and how it's progressed through the global society as a story, that dark story has also been met with just as much light. And, that gives me hope that we will rise up to the challenge and do what we need to do to hopefully keep this planet and our snow and our water as we need it to be.
Great. Thank you for that. Cathy Whitlock.
When the Montana climate assessment was released, my co-authors and I went around the state and talked to communities everywhere. We've probably talked to 5,000 Montanans. And I was really worried about doing that. I was very nervous about doing that because it was way out of my comfort zone to go to small communities and talk to people that I didn't really know. But I was so gratified by the experience because every place we went and almost every person we talked to gets it. They know the climate is changing. They've seen the climate change in their lifetimes, and they're very concerned about it. And so that makes me very hopeful for the future. With the governor, we released a very detailed climate solutions plan that has good ideas. It was a consensus report by businesses and labor groups and nonprofits and state agencies and universities. It's a very good plan. I hope that people will look at it. It's online. And that makes me hopeful too. So I'm hopeful that the tide is turning and that I think we have the wrong impression about what most Montanans think, and we need to act on that.
And I would add to that point, they should all get your link, your URL, and they should help it go viral. Send it to people out of state. I think that's how we can affect change too. Twila.
Yeah, I love this because I actually think we're entering a time when we don't have to look to little things to find hope. We can find big things for producing lots of hope about what's changing. It's these changing attitudes. I was recently learning about a new group called Republican, E-N, Republicans Working Towards Climate Action. I think there's so many people on board at this point, and we just saw in this last presidential election, climate change came up at debates, it was asked about, it was a topic heard about, and now we can see this Biden administration putting people who are thinking about climate change into all of these different sectors. Just as Cathy was talking earlier, climate change isn't a niche. Climate change is attached to every part. We're all in the business of climate change now, whether we wanted to be or not. And having this growing awareness, I feel like I can see hope in so many places. I don't have to dig for it anymore, and that's great news.
Excellent. Well, what a great conversation. I hope we can do more of these. And what a great dynamic group that we've had tonight. Everyone a role model, each one of them. Before we sign off tonight, I want to say again thank you to Mountain Outlaw Partners Media for being one of the co-sponsors, and to Enyon Williams for choreographing this great get-together. One more thing about going viral. This conversation tonight was taped, and it can be accessed through the Explore Big Sky YouTube channel. And I would encourage all of you out there who's listening tonight to send that link around and keep the conversation going. And then lastly, I would say that everybody here has an email address, and I would say everybody here is a good contact point. If you have questions, don't hesitate. You're all open to fielding questions. An informed society makes better decisions. And so anyway, I appreciate all of you tuning in tonight. So thank you.